That's short bio from Mad in America. Robert Whitaker is an American journalist and author who has won numerous awards as a journalist covering medicine and science, including the George Polk Award for Medical Writing and the National Association for Science Writers Award for Best Magazine Article. In 1998, he co-wrote a series on psychiatric research for the Boston Globe that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. His first book, Mad in America, was named by Discover magazine as one of the best science books of 2002. Anatomy of an Epidemic won the 2010 Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award for Best Investigative Journalism. He is the publisher of madinamerica.com. So when I kind of had an idea about the drugs, but didn't feel I could do much about it, especially in comparison to everyone, you know, the other great people doing it. But when I read Mad in America in 2002, in addition to it being really a terrific book, to me, it was a litigation roadmap for how to challenge forced psychiatric drugging, based not really so much on the human rights or civil rights aspect of it, but for it not being in people's best interest. So that galvanized me to form the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, Psych Rights. And we actually on the website, psychrights.org, have posted all of the research that he cites in Mad in America. So that got me going on Psych Rights. I mean, one of the things about Mad in America, in my view, he resurrected soteria houses as a viable approach to people, you know, I like to call people who've gone crazy, but, you know, who were diagnosable with psychosis. And I think Mr. Whitaker is the most influential critic of psychiatry today. And it's an honor to have Mr. Whitaker here lead this panel on Judi's Room.
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here, and that was a way too over flattering portrait of myself, but thanks, Jim. I think what we're talking about tonight is so important. I wish this discussion could be like on national television. That's how important I think it is. What I'd like to do, because I can't do justice to our panel members who you know, are such accomplished people and know so much about this subject and have been engaged in fights with this subject for so long. So what I'm going to do is just go around and ask them to introduce themselves and explain, you know, particularly how they're also involved with the, you know, around the C.A.R.E in California, which is the focus of our panel tonight. So Claire, you want to first talk about, introduce yourself and your own sort of involvements, you know, as an attorney with the whole C.A.R.E Act in California.
Sure, thanks so much. And I'm really happy to be here. So my name is Clare Cortright. I'm an attorney based in Sacramento, California. I currently work for Cal Voices. We're a peer-run organization that does advocacy and direct services for mental health consumers. I don't have a storied history. I identify as a consumer with lived experience of bipolar disorder and also as a psychiatric survivor. So I lost a very large chunk of my life as a result of, you know, an abusive system that didn't help me. So more recently, how I became involved with mental health was I was a patient rights advocate for many years. So if you're placed on one of the longer term involuntary holds in California, you have the right to challenge those holds through a very junky administrative hearing process. So I represented patients, probably a couple of thousand of them at this point, in 2 big counties, 2 small counties. And then subsequently became involved in policy work. And the reason for that was C.A.R.E. It was just so outrageous to me that—
How long you want the timeout to be?
I don't know who that was.
I might be getting timed out, is I think the message. But in any case, so for Cal Voices, I do state level policy. So we're involved in, unfortunately, being on the back foot and fighting a whole raft of legislation coming directly out of the Newsom administration, because we are being, stereotyped and scapegoated and sacrificed on a political altar of California's homeless issue. I think that's probably enough.
That's a great introduction. Of course, we're going to come back to you very quickly, and we're going to talk about what the C.A.R.E Act is, which is the beginning of this, this whole subject we're going to be discussing tonight, which I think is so important. But thank you, Claire. That was great. Keris, can you tell us who you are? Most people know who you are, of course, but and just your engagement already with this, the C.A.R.E Act, and when NPR recently had a story, and of course they came to you. So just if you could introduce yourself, Keris, that'd be great.
Sure. And I'm going to assume people don't know who I am, or they think they know who I am, if that's fair enough. So my name is, of course, Keris Myrick, pronoun she, they. I have long black hair with a gray undercut. Yes, my hair is really gray, but the top part is black. I'm wearing, I think, rainbow rimmed glasses these days, and I'm wearing all black. And I live in California. So, of course, the important things for me is that these bills do impact, or these pieces of legislation do impact me as a person with lived experience who's been given a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So that's how I get involved, primarily just as an independent, I live here and don't F with me kind of thing. F with me or my people, to be clear. Also, I am on the board of Disability Rights California, which is a newer thing. The C.A.R.E court legislation had already been in motion before I came on the board. And then I also host a podcast called Unapologetically Black Unicorns, which aims to really lift up the voices of people of color, brown and Black folks, Native folks, Asian folks, and people who are generally not at the forefront of leadership, but doing amazing things in the mental health advocacy world. And we generally don't have space, meaning that the advocacy world of mental health is primarily white. So we needed to find a space to have these voices and stories and talk about our work. You said something about, PBS came actually to GRC to ask about running a story through their news hour, which is a 10-minute spot on C.A.R.E court. And we wanted to make sure that it did not become a sort of this match between like families and consumers, and somehow families are right and consumers are wrong. So we really had to do some work with PBS to be able to figure out how to do a story that, yes, could talk about each of our lived experiences, but also talk about some of the meatier stuff related to the bill as well. So yeah, that's me.
So we'll talk about this whole idea of shifting the narrative, which what you were involved with PBS. I think you left out one part, Keris, and that is that you spent time at SAMHSA. So you saw at a very high level in SAMHSA how legislation is formed, the politics behind it too, and you bring that experience to, well, this discussion and everything you do.
Yeah. Yes, that and people will know this, and I think that's why people don't really know me, because I think they see me through this lens, as that I was involved with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I was the president of their national board, the first person with schizophrenia, the first Black person to be the president of the board. And I think if I had to say one thing that people don't know about me is that I am an inside advocate. That is my core gift and skill. And I like being in the belly of the beast and giving the beast indigestion while other people are beating the beast in the head. So that's the way I work. But I don't think people sometimes understand that's what I'm doing. So just to be clear, that's what I do.
Oh, that's great. Vesper, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so great to be here with you all. My name is Vesper Moore. I use they, ella pronouns. Ella pronouns are they, them pronouns in Spanish. And I'm a psychiatric survivor. I'm a mad person. I'm a disabled person. I'm a board member at Mind Freedom International. I'm the COO at Kiva Centers. I work in a lot of different roles. I'm a person with black curly hair that's currently up in a bun. I'm wearing a gray t-shirt. I'm in a living room-like setting with 2 couches behind me and a painting. I'm a mixed race indigenous person. It's great to be here with y'all. And I would say there's a lot in terms of the start of my journey of being a part of this movement. And I think that has to do with being involuntarily committed as a teenager, and having police come into my home and take me out of my home, and placing me into what was referred to as intensive care for my own good, but I did not find care at any point during that experience. So, and since then, I would say over these years, I've kind of on a national and somewhat international scale have been working to really examine what does the human rights framework, and civil rights framework specifically in the United States look like when we talk about mental health and disability, and particularly carceral systems that the public believes are meant to be there for some greater good, when in fact we've bought into a falsehood that has really harmed the public.
That's great, thanks. I think the human rights framework is so important. I think that Danius Puris, when he left office as the UN, said we need this framework for thinking about mental health going forward. Susan, do you want to say anything more? You had a chance to somewhat introduce yourself.
Yeah, I could say a little bit more, because I didn't describe myself. Everybody's been really good about doing that. So I'm an older woman, bedbound, with silver gray hair, very pale complexion, and I'm here as a speaker in my role as a parent and a consumer both. I have a son who has Down syndrome and DID, or dissociative identity disorder. And part of the reason I'm speaking is that as a parent, those of us, especially those of us who are older, have great fears for our kids, what's going to happen to them, because homelessness, when we're around, we can protect them. But when we're not around, who's going to be around to protect them? And I've seen my son's life has been threatened so often by different devices that they think are good for people with developmental disabilities. And my son is adopted, so he's actually a Native American descent. And that just adds to the confusion, because it's not like this, they see a white kid with white mom and they sort of pass us by. They see the racial disparity and they automatically make assumptions based on what they see. And I find the level of prejudice around psychiatric disability and being a minority and having an intellectual disability is absolutely huge. And so these kind of courts, I can see what will happen to people like my son. It scares me to death.
Thanks. Well, first of all, it's so great to be on the panel with you all. It's a real honor for me. So to the audience here, what we're going to try to do here for the next 45 minutes, hour is sort of go through a discussion that goes like this. We'll talk about what the C.A.R.E Act is. I think it's important to flesh out what the narrative is behind it, that's showing to sort of promote it and get it accepted by the public. And then we'll talk about, what populations are immediately affected. It obviously affects society as a whole, but there are some populations that are really targeted by this act. And then I think what we want to get into then is like, what are some of the issues and what are some of the ways you create an alternative narrative? You reshape the narratives. And that of course goes into what are some of the harms that are done by this, the violation of civil rights, risks of, even death and that sort of thing. And then we'll finally, once we've gone through this sort of organization of our discussion, we'll look at solutions. How do we go forward in really trying to create a narrative and promote a narrative to the public that can help shift sort of public opinion on this topic? So Claire, I'm going to start with you because you've been so engaged really in fighting the C.A.R.E Court initiative. So tell us in the audience, what is it? What does it do? And what are the boundaries of this law, this legislation?
Sure, absolutely. And cut me off when I get too detailed, because it can become large, but the devil is always in the details with these things. So the C.A.R.E Act and C.A.R.E Court is California's newest court-ordered outpatient treatment program. It's not California's only one. We also have assisted outpatient treatment, aka Laura's Law. It is therefore sort of in the mold of court-ordered outpatient treatment generally, but to my research and observation, the legal standard in C.A.R.E Court, what you have to meet to be involved in C.A.R.E Court is the lowest I've ever seen anywhere in the country. And it's shocking on that level. We'll start there, and I'll just say what it is. So first of all, C.A.R.E Court involves a petitioner, a person who's allowed to petition the court to have you brought into this court process to determine, one, if you even meet criteria to be in C.A.R.E Court, and then two, to create and court order outpatient treatment. The law is falsely promoted all the time as applying only to unhoused people. It does not apply only to unhoused people. It applies to mental health consumers and persons who are dual diagnosed with a mental health condition and substance use disorder. And then it excludes everybody except for one DSM class, diagnosis class, to be in C.A.R.E Court. And what they chose was schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders DSM class. And when you hear that, you would think, okay, well, it includes everybody who has psychosis. It does not. It does not include bipolar disorder, MDD with psychosis, PTSD. So they really focus down on irrationally onto schizophrenia and schizophrenia spectrum disorders. So there's 27 different groups of people who can petition the court to get you in. That includes family members and people, and I think the lowest standard, kind of the person who has the least business doing this, is just anybody you live with, right? So I have a housemate. My housemate could petition me to be in C.A.R.E Court, despite not being a mental health professional, knowing anything about me. Maybe she was here 2 days. So in terms of who can hail you into this process, it's different. AOT in California, it has to be a county. It has to be a behavioral health provider, not so in C.A.R.E Court. So what happens is, to get somebody in C.A.R.E Court, you just have to say the magic words. And those magic words are essentially, this person is an adult, they're 18 or over, they have the specified diagnosis, they are alleged to be not, quote, clinically stabilized in ongoing voluntary treatment. And our judicial counsel says, so this includes people who are currently engaged in voluntary treatment, and the petitioner feels that you're not optimally stable. It's not effective. So, there's all these misconceptions. One, this doesn't apply to unhoused people. Two, this doesn't apply to people who are refusing, traditional treatment or any treatment. All right. This doesn't apply to people who are refusing to take medications. I mean, it's that kind of, the net is that wide. And then, so this petitioner kind of goes and says the magic words to the court, and all they really have to back it up with is some behavioral health professional stamping their seal of approval on it. And again, that person can have never met you, and be doing this based on records that they can't verify the truth of, right? They didn't create the record. You're not their provider. So that's how low it is to kind of get that petition in the front door. And then the court looks at it and they apply this nothing standard called prima facie evidence. So the court kind of looks at this petition and says, if I treat all of these things as true, does this person meet C.A.R.E Court criteria? So that's not a bar, right? No petition's getting kicked out at that stage. A court, if you said the magic words, now you're in C.A.R.E Court. So then kind of what happens next is there's heavy involvement of the county behavioral health services departments. So essentially it's kind of like, my roommate can bring me in the front door, but the court is actually going to sub out that person for the county.
Join the meeting.
So it's a very odd setup, because essentially the court is making the counties prosecute people. So kind of what happens then is, a flimsy process, including, the court saying, well, I have enough evidence here to be suspicious that you meet these very low criteria of not being optimally stable. And so, you know, you have to go sit for a court-ordered evaluation of your mental health. So you have to go be witness against yourself, right? You don't, in a civil case, have the ability to say, well, I don't want to talk to the state because that incriminates me and I don't agree with this process. You know, they're going to court order you to be evaluated. And then on the basis of, you know, this court evaluation, whatever dirt the county can dig up on you, including by getting your medical records without your consent from other providers, even though the county's not treating you, they're not your doctor, you know, etc. Like there's, you know, they have written in recently all of these powers to just go grab people's medical records and do a fishing expedition to show that they should be in C.A.R.E court. So there are hearings, but again, they're administrative hearings, meaning it's kind of not a real court. There's not a lot of protections that we would traditionally use in a court around what kind of evidence can come in. You know, in a traditional sort of civil or criminal court, there would be, you know, arguments filed in writing and back and forth, and a much more robust process to try to make sure that evidence that comes in is legitimate, that people have notice of what's going to be said. So it's this very watered down court process. And, you know, if the court finds by clear and convincing evidence before it that you meet the C.A.R.E Act criteria, then the court is permitted to court order you a C.A.R.E plan. And what is in that C.A.R.E plan is kind of a mystery. You know, it says the court can order you to behavioral health services and supports. The court can order you to, quote, necessary stabilizing medications, another meaningless concept. And the court can order you to housing. So one might ask, I think, was that my toot? One might ask, okay, you know, what happens if I just say no? What happens if I just defy you? And the answer is not a lot, because if they were to create, you know, if they were to send you to jail for refusing to take your medications on the basis that you're not optimally stable, that law would stand for all of about 3 seconds before it was struck down as unconstitutional. So some people are looking at C.A.R.E court, and there's an emerging narrative in California that says, like, this is kind of stupid, you know, like you have this whole court process, you're hailing people into court, you're doing all of this sort of pageantry, but at the end of the day, we can kind of do what we want without a lot of consequence. And, you know, the answer as to why C.A.R.E court doesn't have more teeth or more consequence is it just wouldn't be legal on the legal standard to get you in the front door. But there is some teeth, and, you know, what those teeth are is, look, if you're not going to cooperate with us, if you're not going to follow your C.A.R.E plan, then we are going to sort of label you a scofflaw. And in the event that you are ever brought into a conservatorship hearing or an AOT Laura's Law hearing, or for other purposes yet undefined, we're going to treat your scofflawing as evidence that you need to be conserved, or you need to be in another court-ordered outpatient treatment program. So there are consequences to it, and they're irrational, right? Because if you're getting me into C.A.R.E court, even though I'm engaged in voluntary treatment, taking my medications, and you feel I'm not optimally stable, well, that really has nothing to do with conservatorship criteria that are, can you provide for food, clothing, and shelter, right? These things don't line up. So why would you be using my scofflawing in C.A.R.E court as a legal step? There is also baked into this, there's a lot of rhetoric around it. And, you know, one of the other things that can happen in the C.A.R.E court process is you can be approached and have a settlement agreement, right? A C.A.R.E agreement, and they're calling this voluntary. And I said, you know, I was like voluntary, like a plea deal is voluntary, right? You know, this C.A.R.E agreement is supposedly voluntary. It's not voluntary, right? If it were truly voluntary, I could just say, go away, and that would be the end of it. So, you know, this C.A.R.E agreement is also a potential outcome of C.A.R.E court. And then C.A.R.E court lasts for a year, but it's renewable for a second year. And once this C.A.R.E plan is in place, you have to show up to court every 60 days for a case management conference where we're going to talk about whether you're following your C.A.R.E plan. You know, the other thing the court can do is essentially order you a psychiatric hold, but they really can't order you a psychiatric hold because you're not complying with C.A.R.E court. They actually have to meet danger to self, danger to others, or grave disability. So it's like, you know, on the one hand, it doesn't have, you know, the scariest teeth it might have. But again, the reason for that is it would be illegal. And you know, it is clearly a form of, you know, coercion, surveillance, harassment, really, to have somebody tell you have to go to court every 60 days because they think you're not stable. It's pretty harassing. So, you know, it is sort of an equal measure, not clearly effective for anything, and a real violation of people's privacy rights. And just to me, it's psychologically abusive to do this to someone.
So Claire, that's a great presentation of what the contours of the law are. I have to say it's a rather remarkable contour, especially, and there's no sense of danger to self or danger to others. It's a stability thing. That's a remarkable thing to assert. That was great. I'm just going to move this along a little bit so as we can move through these sort of different dimensions of this story. And what I'd like, and I think one of the things that we need to always to do is to understand, well, what is the story being told that gets the public behind something like this? So most everyone here is associated, you know, is familiar with arguments as to why this can be harmful. It's a violation of civil rights. It's a, you know, taking agency away from people. But if you're going to fight this in the political arena, the first thing you have to understand is, how is it being sold to the public? And Keris, that was exactly what you got involved with when I thought it was NPR, but it was PBS came to you with you know, wanting to do a story about this. So can you tell us what is the story that's being used to sell this, and what do we need to learn from that story?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of things, and sadly, this is not sitting in a vacuum. It's sitting in a larger context of things that have been happening in California and also nationally. So I think that's important to pay attention to. And I hope we also said what C.A.R.E stands for. I don't remember if I heard, because, okay, so I might want to start there, that C.A.R.E is actually an acronym. I prefer not to write it as C.A.R.E, but rather C.A.R.E, because it stands for Community Assistance, Recovery, and Empowerment Act. And so when we look at the words, we have to question, you know, start right there. Oh, recovery and empowerment happening in a court feels a little oxymoronic. So that might be kind of a place to start to question, to look deeper and understand exactly what's going on. And so when this all started actually was, the first thing was trying to advance LPS, which they're still doing again, but they were not able to advance LPS to open it up to a broader way of being able to get people into LPS, ladder and petrus short, conservatorship, guardianship, those things, those kind of things. They tried to do that several years ago prior to C.A.R.E court. They were unsuccessful in being able to get any legislation out the door on that particular piece. The other thing that happens in California is we are county driven. We have 58 counties. And so even though it is a state, of course, things are county driven. So counties can opt in to doing certain things. So one of the things that is county opt-in is AOT, assisted outpatient treatment. And so we do not have county-wide or statewide assisted outpatient treatment. We only have a few counties that actually have implemented assisted outpatient treatment, or AOT. Governor not too happy about that. And this was also a way to force the counties to do a version of AOT by having C.A.R.E court. Because I've already seen it in the chat. There are some people who say, well, this sounds like AOT. Well, it does, doesn't it? So it's kind of a AOT light-ish. And I think that's kind of being kind by saying it that way, but it's not strictly AOT, but it is now county-wide. All counties must do it. But I think the reason that the public can go, oh yeah, this makes sense, is also because the voters actually had said there are two things, the top two things that they wanted addressed in California. These are California voters and others, but basically if we're looking at California voters, there are two things they needed to address. One was homelessness, and the second one was safety. And so a lot of times you put those two things together, those are super complex things to fix, especially for the public. The public doesn't like complex. Complex is like, what? Blow my mind. I can't do that. Please make it simple for me. And so usually you put those things together, you kind of, it's like 1 + 1 = 2. Homelessness plus safety equals, oh, well, let's go after mental illness. That's an easy sort of fix. That's easy for the public to wrap their heads around, because in general, they will see people who are unhoused and maybe they're naked in the street, or they may, be screaming and things like that. And to the public, that equals homelessness, even though it's a small minority of people who may be out there kind of with these struggles. And these struggles can be due to anything. We don't know what these struggles are, why people are out naked or screaming or what have you. But the assumption is, well, they're mentally ill. And if we can get these folks out of sight, kind of like ugly laws, and Vesper can talk about all about ugly laws, right? If we can get them out of sight, then it looks like we've addressed homelessness. So I think that's part of, like, all of these things come together, and it's like, okay, how do we address this very public problem in a way that the public will say, as voters, because remember, this is a governor who also wants to run for president, just saying, that these are things that all kind of come into the equation. But the other thing is that, and we know it as family members, we know it as people with lived experience, the systems have failed us. They have failed us. And so I don't think there's any denying that what our family members are struggling with is 1000% system failure. And the part of C.A.R.E, and I think that, and that's also an AOT, but people don't talk about AOT this way, is that there's a part of it that also is holding the system accountable. So it's not just the person who, and this should have never been that the person should really go into court. Like, one of the things I advocated for is the system needs to be put in court. The system needs to be held accountable for providing services when and where and how a person needs them, not just being, let off the hook and kind of saying, oh, well, I can't help that person, or I'm not going to, provide the person the services that they need. So one of the things that is in C.A.R.E is some obligations for the county, and actually teeth for the county if they do not also provide the services that are in the CARE plan or the CARE agreement. So I think probably not answering all of your questions, but hoping I am, but I'm probably adding other things in because there's so much. But I think what happened with it was PBS, you're right, it was PBS, not NPR. But I think I did something for NPR too. But I think what has happened is they've, everybody has tried to pit families against consumers. And so then you really are not talking about the issues at hand. Rather, we keep lifting up this tension between the family experience and the consumer experience. When both sides really want, if you will, if there are sides, really want the best for that particular person. That's really what we all want, but instead it's easier to have this tension. If you divide people, you conquer. That's kind of what's going on. And so when I was pulled into this because of NPR, PBS, and others, I have been asked to be pitted as a person who has been in involuntary treatment, to be pitted against a family member. And I have said, I will absolutely not do that, that I don't feel that's productive. And I think, we need to move beyond this, the family's right, the consumer is wrong, the consumer's right, the family is wrong. Absolutely not. So really what I appreciate that PBS tried to do was something quite complex in a 10-minute session. They only had 10 minutes for news hour, so she didn't have a lot of time, is they presented a family story complete with the person living with and the family member who supports that person, as well as another family member. And those folks were not in support of C.A.R.E, and then another family member who was in support of C.A.R.E. And the hardest part of that story was when I asked, well, this is about safety. And can't you understand that this is about, from the family member who supports C.A.R.E and who supports involuntary treatment, getting people into treatment involuntarily. So can't you understand that this is about keeping family members safe and keeping my family safe? And as someone who was to a NAMI affiliate where a young man killed his mother, so I knew the young man, I knew the family. ran a peer-run organization that worked at Twin Towers Jail. Can name off people, who have really struggled in the way that our family members are struggling. I have to answer that I don't believe that involuntary treatment can keep people safe. There is the trauma that is involved that sometimes our family members don't see because we may be too ashamed to tell them, as I was too ashamed to tell my parents what was going on. And then also, I can list off people who have died in the course of people trying to get them into involuntary care. Mytrice Richardson, who was picked up by the police, and the family said, keep her, we'll come and pick her up. And the police, we don't know what happened, but basically the police did let her go in the middle of the night. No wallet, no phone, no money, no nothing, up in the hills of Malibu. So Black young woman. She was never to be found again. When we asked family advocates, the family asked family advocates to help and peer advocates to help. And I think it was one of those things where people didn't quite know what to do. But at the end of the day, when Mytrice was struggling with a bipolar disorder, she was known to have bipolar disorder. She was in distress. They were supposed to keep her till the family could come the next day because they didn't live in that area. They actually lived further away in Los Angeles County. And when they came the next day, she was gone. Police didn't know where she went, but police let her go is what happened. And she was found a year later dead. Miles Hall, who our 988 bill is named after here in California, was killed by the police when his family was encouraged to call the police to get him a 5150, et cetera. And I can go on and on. So yeah.
Keris, we're going to want you to go on in a bit, because now you're getting into this as sort of how do you counter this narrative? And you start with it doesn't work, and there's all these harms as well. But I think one thing for us all to recognize here is this narrative that supports it in the public does appeal to safety. And it also though appeals to, if you have a belief that getting people into care that it will make their lives better, that everything will work and they'll stabilize again and that sort of thing. You can appeal to things, saying that this is a humanitarian thing to do as well. So even though maybe what's driving the public is get people out of sight and safety issues, but they can say to themselves, and this is a humanitarian thing to do. And I think that's one of the reasons this sometimes has such a powerful appeal to the public, because there's a sense that we're helping people. So I think it's really good to what you've done here is to identify how this narrative fits within sort of the public mind. So I'm going to go to Susan real quickly, because one of the things we've talked about Claire began this, and this, who all is going to get wrapped up in this? Now, when I, from an outsider, looked at this, I thought it was mostly unhoused people, to be honest with you. I thought it was basically a means to get people off the streets and put them somewhere else. But Claire, Susan, you've been working with this organization that is seeing with disabilities also being wrapped up with this. And can you talk us a little bit about how you see this extending to people in the disability communities and that sort of thing?
Susan, you just need to unmute.
About that. I think there's a general understanding amongst families who have children who have become adults with disabilities that they're responsible for their care for the rest of their lives. And to some degree that's true, but to another degree it's not. There is, people with disabilities do become independent, but if they become independent in a way that their parents don't agree with, then care courts is a perfect way to undermine what the person with the disability wants for themselves. So it creates a competition that shouldn't exist, because what parents need in order to give their kids the support that they need is we need a better system that supports families, that doesn't pit the person with the disability against their parents. Because one of the things that I've seen happen way too often is people who have children in their 20s that are high need and are required to become their guardians in order to get care for them. Because if their adult children remain independent, then they aren't entitled to certain services. So they become their guardians, and then the guardians, their role as a guardian enlarges their responsibility as the person is an adult, rather than diminishes as it grows older. Because ideally, the parent of any person over time, their role is going to diminish in terms of providing care, and other people will step in. But that's not the way the system works. If you have a child that's 18 years old, you are not thinking that that child is going to be independent in the next 5 years. You're thinking that maybe that child won't ever be independent. And so the care courts sort of are now sort of a place that you could think, okay, when I can't do this anymore, then the care court is going to step in and take care. And right now, there aren't a lot of other choices. So it looks really good, but they're not going to be doing what's best. I don't believe they're going to be doing what's best for the person with a disability who wants to be independent, and their independence may not fit the stereotypical, this is what an adult human life looks like. So they're more impoverished than the norm. They are willing to deal with things that others can't because their independence is so important to them. So they're willing to put up with things that others might not put up with. They may hope for better, but that's just not possible. But when the outsider looks in, they see the person with a disability struggling and not living up to what they think they should be, the life they should have. And they think they need to intervene and take over. And it's too often I see people with disabilities' lives being shattered by very well-meaning people who think they know better than the person with a disability. And I think the care courts is just going to sort of eat up those people who are and say, you know, we want you on board to help identify people out there that need our services, and not the services to help them remain independent, but the services to take over and now confine them in ways that are more socially acceptable than what is the current norm.
You know, the most amazing thing I've heard so far tonight is that you can just report someone to care court. So in other words, someone within the house can report someone else and say, this person, I can report him to care court and start this process, which is really an astonishing sort of ability to force someone into a court proceeding that takes away, as you just said, Susan, their agency, their control over their own life, whether they be a person with a disability or a person with a diagnosis. It's an incredible expansion of the power of the state to remove agency from people, regardless of, you know, what can. And I didn't realize it was this broad. Vesper, I'm going to, we've been talking, you brought this up when we spoke a few days ago about how this panel might go. And that is about shifting the narrative, because we've talked about a narrative that's out there that supports this legislation, that sort of thing. But the public responds to simple narratives. So before we get into what the counter narrative might be, can you just talk within your own political understanding and your work at both the national and international level, how important it is to shift the narrative, and how you see, you know, what sort of narrative should we actually be going towards here?
Absolutely. And, you know, I think there's so much, so many important points we've talked about so far. And I think there's an importance to the history, because when we don't look at where we've been, what we've done in the past, and we don't think about that as a society, we have a lot of people who I think, you know, we've talked about this in other Judi's Room sessions and other spaces where we've talked about the fact that people don't remember institutions like Willowbrook. They don't remember ugly laws. They don't remember a lot of these different pieces. Or if they do, you know, they they may have not been alive during that time, and it may seem like something that was in the distant past. But when we look at ugly laws, right, they were active till like the 1970s. When you look at institutions like Willowbrook, you also have them like around that same time frame, and we never fully deinstitutionalized. And we have this idea, right, that like, oh, okay, this has happened, we're in a good place, we have all of these robust community behavioral health approaches, which is the public narrative. It's like, oh, okay, it's okay, we'll invest more in community behavioral health. But when you have a system in the United States that's designed to keep beds full, right, because they bill per bed, when you have private companies that are investing into political campaigns, when you have all of these things, really the fight against involuntary commitment ends up being contrary to American industry and American capitalism. So that's a big part of the struggle when I look at it, because one thought, like on an international human rights perspective, is if we were to ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, if we were to follow the guidelines on deinstitutionalization, even in an event of an emergency, which we were in an event of an emergency the last 3-4 years, and we still have not followed those guidelines on deinstitutionalization. So, and the reason for that, right, is private industry and private investment in America. And it's difficult because when you look at organizing in the 70s and the 80s, it wasn't as prevalent. But now you have a well-funded campaign that is contrary in so many ways. So for me, that perspective is that we do need to have a kind of a very strategic effort of uplifting this as a human rights issue within the United States, but also to call on international partners. And we need to make examples of some states. What is happening in California with the C.A.R.E court could be that example. Actually having a national front that is organizing against some of these bills that where people are being labeled as gravely disabled, like in SB 43, and actually saying like, we won't stand by this. We fought for the rights of disabled people to live in community for so many years, right? Kind of across context. Why is the United States someone who is an entity that has signed on to, the United Nations in a lot of regards, helped in the beginning, in the 1940s, right, when there's the Bill of Human Rights, right, and yet we stray so far away from the actual rights of folks in the disability community at large. It's terrible. And then when we look at ugly laws earlier, the unsightly beggar ordinances, that wasn't just for folks who are disabled and considered what a lot of folks would call disfigured. It also applied to unhoused people who were poor and living on the street. If you were deemed unsightly in any context, right, that you needed to be physically removed, physically warehoused, and put into a different space. But what it does is it feeds a larger industry and a larger machine. It does in part have to do with pharmaceutical companies, but it also has to do with behavioral health centers and meeting their annual quota. It also has to do with it's a very large, complex mechanism when I look at it.
Yeah, I think you were obviously talking about this sort of a larger historical societal narrative to think about human rights. And I think you can put it a little bit into, like, if we look at the past and things that we now view with horror, right? Remind us of those past things of horror and then liken them to what we're doing today. That's sort of a powerful memory jog, I think, in it. And the other thing that you're speaking about here, this goes to human rights, and it goes to something Clare said when we met the other day, and it's that all this is happening within a capitalistic, profit-driven society, right? This whole thing. And Clare was talking about there would be money for for private organizations to build new housing facilities, etc. So I think anything that sort of helps us think about who we are as a society writ large and what society we want to be is a helpful way to start to think about a counter narrative. So what I'd like to do now is sort of open it up the discussion of, a freewheeling discussion of what should, first of all, what are the problems with this? What are some of, Keris, you started with this. What are some of the real harms that can be done with this law? And and let's talk about some of the ways that facts that could be brought out that really undercut that popular narrative that this is a thing for safety, helps people get, good care, better lives, that sort of thing. So open it up to all of you, and then just how do we basically critique this narrative and supplant it?
I actually wanted to dovetail something that Susan said that I'm so appreciative of, and what I've tried to carry through as part of my work around C.A.R.E as well. There are two critical things that I've been trying to carry through, among others. And I think it's exactly right that where has the support, where have we looked at this from a family systemic issue? And in C.A.R.E, the C.A.R.E legislation, I found it woefully lacking in support for family members. That families are going through their own trauma, they need to go through their own healing, that the process sometimes that the supports that they need in order to support their loved one is lacking. And many times when I'm in meetings, I'm hearing complete and utter frustration, anger about system failures, lack of true support. And I'm not just talking about like NAMI family to family. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about trauma-informed support. Our families are traumatized sometimes because their family members go missing. They don't know where their family members are. I've had similar situation with my family members, and it's very traumatizing, but where's the family support for the family? Just because the loved one may be in a C.A.R.E process or in treatment doesn't mean that the family doesn't still need extra support. What they put in the C.A.R.E Act actually was psychoeducation. That was it. It's like, I think the family members have a lot of information already that is psychoeducation based, but they don't have any kind of ongoing family trauma and recovery support. The other issue, Bob, that I think we need to talk about, that sadly someone said, hey, why the hell are we talking about this in a recent LA Times article, is about racial equity. I am sorry to say that we are sitting in a country in which people of color, primarily Black men and brown folk, have been overdiagnosed with schizophrenia, or overrepresented in the homelessness population, or overrepresented in the jail population. And so we cannot just sit here and not talk about that and just say, well, that's not important. Basically, then you're saying we're still throwaway, and that we're going to continue to have services and supports within this process that don't meet cultural, linguistic, and ethnic needs. And that's a sad state of affairs. So I think, we have to address the fact that in California, we have a Black Reparations Act. And the recommendations from that act, of which they have a committee, are not to continue to pass any legislation that perpetuates or could perpetuate disparities in the health arena. This is one of those laws in which it was passed against the recommendation of the Black Reparations Act for Black Californians. So I think, we're talking out of two sides of our face. If it doesn't work for some people, it will not work for all people. And we have to recognize that. So I'm sorry I have to speak so adamantly or passionately about this particular issue, but we sometimes paint everything as if it is with the same broad stroke that it'll work for everyone, and it will not. So I think we have to pay attention to race and ethnicity, and also the overrepresented people who will be affected by these laws that continue to put people in court versus giving them the services and supports voluntarily in the community where they can receive them, even if they don't believe they have a mental health condition. There are still things that we can provide to people, even if they don't believe they have a mental health condition. What do they believe? What will they accept? How can we help them? We spend no money on that. We spend no time in working on providing those primary, secondary, tertiary interventions that can support people, whether they believe they have a mental health condition or not. Instead, we go for the easy thing, which is go for the courts and force them into it, because it's the harder thing to take that time, to have relentless outreach and engagement and supportive services, to have more peer respites, to have more family respites. Where are they? Where are they?
So two things real quick, Keris. I think I'm glad you brought up the racial angle because it's so front and center here. And it's also, I think, if you bring it up, that does become a reason to say how wrong this process, this is. And, you know, there's plenty of evidence that Black men in particular get diagnosed with schizophrenia, whereas whites get diagnosed with bipolar and that sort of thing. So I think you need to make this, I'm so glad you're making this part of it. The other thing I hear from you, though, of course, is the C.A.R.E court starts to say the problem is in the individual, right? And you're going to fix the individual. What you're all saying here is, no, we need to fix society. You need to have a different society around providing shelter, support for families. So I think part of that's the conception we need to really focus on is like, it's not about fixing individuals. It's about creating a different society here. And that the fact that you're even having this legislation is a sign of sort of real social failure, societal failure. You know, that's just my opinion there. Others on sort of how to attack this narrative, critique this narrative, the racial elements to it, I think are so profound. The fact that we're not supporting families, so profound, so good. Other ideas about how you can sort of critique this narrative.
Well, I think when we do talk about Black and brown folks in the United States and policing across several contexts, I've seen some people refer to involuntary commitment and psychiatric intervention as forms of soft policing, and it's not soft at all. It's a very, very like rough and traumatizing experience for a lot of people. And I think there is a narrative of help, and there's a use of this idea of mental health treatment, right, or access to mental health treatment that I think as within the disability movement, we have to contend with, within prison abolition and prison reform movements, we have to contend with, within many different civil rights movements, within the peer movement, within the MAD movement, it's like survivor movement. Like, we do need to contend with a lot of these things. I think a big part of it is that people assume like, okay, access, but we're not asking the question, access to what? We're not really illustrating that. And people are using these forms of what is believed as access to treatment as like, oh, okay, this is great because we can get them out of this prison where they are being abused in this way, that way, right? But instead, we should really be like, okay, yes, we want to work on getting people out of there, right? But what are they accessing afterwards? Is it a robust community network where they actually are living in community? Are we fulfilling the promise of the civil rights we do have in the United States, such as Olmstead, such as the ADA, such as the things that we have so far? And I also think it's interesting that often folks who are diagnosed with mental health conditions, we are often lumped in the substance use community, but on a federal level, we are separated from the disability community, which by extension separates us from our civil rights that we have in the United States, because they are all designed through the lens of disability within the disability community. So there is a need to return and really contend with a lot of these things too.
Claire, you have your hand up?
Yeah, this is just my opinion and definitely my own, but sort of a recent conclusion that I've come to, because I am listening to the lawmakers who have written these laws, who are pushing new ones. I'm listening to their mouthpieces in the press, you know, frankly, things that look like planted stories, etc. And I'm convinced that we can get nowhere until we start naming hate, ableism, and discrimination that is polluting any kind of dialogue around, you know, what makes sense to do. I think all of us as mental health consumers, like, we've all been harmed by this system, and we've all been harmed for the same reason: hate, ableism, discrimination, that we are passively accepting that it is okay to do physical violence to people who have a disability. And I just think that has to fundamentally change. And, the public discourse in California, what ends up in the media is just straight up hate. It is just people saying that we are inferior, that we can't think our way out of a paper bag, that we're incompetent, that we are children. It should be regarded legally and in this, paternalistic framework. And even that people can't hear and can't recognize that paternalism is a statement of supremacy. I'm the parent, you're the child, and it's really like we have suffered for 7,000 years from these supremacist narratives that we are inferior, we are biologically fundamentally different and aberrant. We're different, we can be treated different legally, we can be treated different socially. And it is really, it is a bad situation. We face systemic discrimination in employment, in housing, in education. Not only are we, disproportionately incarcerated, we are the most disproportionately incarcerated people. We are the people most likely to be killed in an interaction with police. And I think until you get to that root, and when you hear this narratives, and you don't have to call people names, they like to call us names, but I don't have to call you a name. I can point out that your reasoning, it doesn't hold water, that ultimately where your perception rests is in a stereotype, which is just an error of inductive reasoning. It's just not smart, right? Hate is not smart. It's not a way to solve any problems. But I feel like, we're constantly restricted in how we're allowed to talk about people who are holding us up for contempt and abuse and hate. And I'm getting to a point where I'm willing to name it.
So we're getting some hands raised up, and maybe just one last question, and then we'll open it up for the audience to ask questions. The last question I have really for you all is this. One, just to speak a little bit about, we've spoken about the trauma that can come with forced treatment. Maybe we can just speak about the harm that just comes from someone taking over your life in this way, whether it be police coming to your door or also being under a guardianship. And also, we haven't really talked about what forced treatment means when the idea is to stabilize people. And what does it mean when you're going to all of a sudden have a court order to say you have to take an antipsychotic, which you may not want to take, for example. So just a little bit about what is the harm that is done, that can be done from forced treatment, being put into a court environment where you're going to lose agency over yourself. And part of that loss of agency is even sort of authority over your own mind, whether or not you want to take a drug. So a little bit about that, and then we'll open it up to all the hands that are up, and we'll open up a discussion.
Well, I can talk to that on a personal experience with my son. When my son first was diagnosed with DID, they first labeled it as schizophrenia, and they wanted to give him certain drugs because of schizophrenia. He was acting out in very violent ways with his DID, and the drugs that they gave him made it worse. And institutionalization was being offered to me, not what's at the root of this increased negative behavior that's going on. Why suddenly when we give you drugs that were supposed to cure this situation, is he worse? And I was fighting with everybody right and left because everybody was pushing me to institutionalize him. And what I decided to do instead was withdraw from all of the psychiatric treatment he was getting, and just to deal with him one-on-one. And I accepted who he was as a person with at that moment thought it was schizophrenia, and said, I'm going to accept, in my mind, I'm going to accept you the way you are and not perceive this as a negative thing, but this is who you are, and I'm going to deal with you. And suddenly the violent person disappeared. It was amazing to me how accepting him as he was what he needed. It was what he needed all along, was acceptance for all the behavior that other people had determined was aberrant. And the aberrant behavior that I'd been struggling with for months, it wasn't necessary for him anymore to do it, because now he was an accepted person. And I see so often families struggle with their adult children who they don't know what to do, and they're going to professionals, and the options they're being given are group homes, institutions, psychiatric treatment, and it's not helping the family learn how to adapt and grow and accept their child with their disability. It's always cure. That's always the focus.
And Keris,
So I generally start this conversation with a
Vesper,
quote.
any sort of thoughts on this issue?
Oh yeah, can you hear me, Bob?
Yeah, I'll just,
Yeah, I can hear you.
Bob, can you hear Keris? Keris was.
Yeah.
Yes, I can. I can
Yeah,
hear
okay,
Keris.
sorry. So I generally start the question about what it's like to be in, treatment that's forced on you. I'll put it that way. And I start with a quote, it's a Native American quote that says, "Force, no matter how concealed, begets resistance." And that is not a quote from the disability movement. It's not a quote from people with mental illness. It is a quote about human beings, that this is how human beings function. Think about any time in your life when you've been forced to do something that you don't want to do, that you don't think you ought to do, that you don't even know why it pertains to you. Generally, you resist that thing. And what happens is we don't have the dignity to be able to resist, right? Like, oh no, you can't resist because you have anosognosia. It's like, yes, I can resist and I shall resist. And I think, for me, it was very traumatizing. And there were times that I will say, and I've heard people say, oh, it saved my life. Okay, but what was the consequence of that life saving was also living a life of trauma, of having a fear of doing a lot of things, not doing those things because I was told I couldn't, I shouldn't, I wouldn't, and that I needed to kind of obey this one way of being that didn't fit me at all. And I was literally not just traumatized, I was miserable because I wasn't living a life. And I think, this idea that the other narrative of, we want people to die with their rights on. What we want is people to live, and people to live with their rights on. And we provide so many different opportunities and suggestions about how this living can happen. So I also want to just kill that narrative about we want people to die with their rights on. I just want to stick a fork in it and say, no, that's not what we're talking about. But at the end of the day, I think also, people never understood the power of no. It's just as powerful as yes. So saying no to something, you may need to say no to something because it really just doesn't work for you. And you need people to believe it doesn't work for you and have the curiosity and depth and time to explore. What does it mean for you to take medication? What does it mean for you to be in treatment? Because there's meaning to it that people can express, whether it be verbally, drawing, whatever, that we need to get to the core of what does this mean for people and what does it mean to have a life for people and how do we support that? Because that wasn't supported for me for so long. And like Claire, I feel like so much of my life was stolen that I call schizophrenia, quite frankly, a thief. Stole from me and stole from my family.
Well, those are powerful words, Keris. Vesper, last thought before we open this up?
yeah, I think one, I want y'all to sit with what Keris just said, because that's so important. But two, I do think what we've been talking about throughout is family solidarity and survivor solidarity and movement solidarity and what these things actually look like. Because something that we're seeing is that private corporations have been focusing on a narrative that puts family against survivors with direct life experience. And simultaneously, a part of that is that we are holding this idea that yeah, some people define this as life destroying, others define it as life saving. But this whole idea of force, right? The very idea of carcerality, punitive culture that we live in, right? That comes from something else. If we had something that, a more robust community designed like system, if you will, that where none of this was what was required in the first place, we wouldn't miss it, honestly. So that's a big part of it. And I want to leave folks with that's a big part of it. And I also want to say that we need to uplift more stories of people who have direct life experience with involuntary commitment, but we also need like family members who are angry about what happened to their children and their family and other folks. We need other narratives. Because the thing is that the public narrative, what it is right now, is often family members, often white family members who are, happy that their kid was able to access this treatment because it provided this, or that. But their overall quality of life, what has happened to them, it's just been altered entirely. So yes, uplifting these stories, I think, is crucial to that public narrative too.
And can I jump in here, Susan, from Mind Freedom? Thanks. So we have some hands raised, and I think when we get to that, we should start with, I think it's Eddie Zuber, and then Scott, and someone whose name I can't see, who's had their hands up for some time when we get to that part. But I do want to add one thing, Keris, I was glad you talked about anagnosia, because Bob, you asked what's part of the narrative. Well, part of the narrative is that we have this fake thing we call a symptom, that people are in denial, and that's a symptom. And you told me recently, and then I think we really need to go to hands raised, but you told me recently in another meeting about a study. I said, I haven't seen any studies that this is a real thing. This is a thing they talk about for people who have brain insults and strokes. And you said there was some research you knew, but could you just share that? Because this is part of the narrative,
Yeah, I should have looked up this study. The study was where they were looking at people who lacked insight into their illness and therefore weren't taking their drugs. And then they compared them to those people who accepted the narrative that they were ill and took their drugs willingly. And what they found was that those who actually resisted the disease narrative that they were ill, they were the ones who had the better long-term outcomes, because they weren't seeing themselves through this chronic, sort of disabled, hopeless future. Now, the irony was, even though it was better outcomes for those with that condition of not accepting insight, not having insight into their illness, the researchers said, instead of saying like, well, maybe we need to rethink this and encourage people not to think of themselves in this way, they said, oh, we have to redouble our efforts now to convince people that they are indeed sick. So it was such an amazing piece where, and rather than following their outcomes, which showed this was leading to better outcomes, where people were rejecting that sort of chronic illness narrative, they just doubled down and said, well, this just shows that we just need to double down and get people to accept this narrative. But yeah, that was the result of that study. And you can see why it makes sense.
And that's what they call a symptom.
What's that?
That's what they call a symptom, anagnosia. It's like, anyway, so if we go to hands, I think it's Eddie or Edie, and Scott has had hands raised, and someone whose name I can't see on my screen, but has lots of beautiful, colorful things. And then Sam is what I've been seeing in that order. When you're ready.
That'll be Vanessa, the person with the multicolored screen.
Thank you, Vanessa. I couldn't see your name. Thank you, Vesper. I couldn't see your name.
Okay, thanks, Susan. And I raised my hand a long time ago. I'll try to be succinct because I heard other things after I raised my hand, but I wanted to respond to Claire. Thank you so much for pointing out the thing about paternalism, because I have trouble even using the term peer, because I feel like if we're calling ourselves peers, we're kind of buying into the idea that the providers or the system or the authorities are somehow better than us, that they are supposed to have authority over us. And so I've struggled with being involved in peer support, because it's like, we're all peers, peer has to do with how old you are. But anyway, and then talking about saving people's lives, but they're also shortening their lives a lot of times. You know, these medications can take decades off people's lives, and so it might save them short term, or the intervention might save them short term, but long term it's not great. But what I raised my hand about was whether anybody is talking about bringing back residential hotels to deal with the homeless situation, and whether, if they are, that might take on the flavor of reinstitutionalizing people, or if it's just like, it doesn't have to have any kind of mental health services or framework or anything, just getting people into a safe, comfortable space where they have less stress and they're not going to be wigging out and then acting out. And so, I mean, I think there are a lot of things from the like 19th and maybe early 20th century that we need to revive. And so yeah, that was my question. Whether that is, you know, even being.
We do have some of those programs in Los Angeles County. The sad part about it, however, is that there are a couple of things that happen is people will get their room, and then in 2 weeks they have to move to another room, and then in another 2 weeks they have to move to. It's not like you get to live there and stay there as if this is your place where you live with the supports that you need to live there. So that's one thing. Also, part of the C.A.R.E Act is that a person gets a housing plan. You cannot live in a plan. A plan is a piece of paper. So the question is, where's the housing? Thirdly, we're not talking about the ridiculous cost of housing in California, that many people are unhoused because it's because of the cost of living and ridiculous price housing. It's overpriced. And like when we did a count in Los Angeles, there was more empty units than there were unhoused people. So that tells you we have a cost issue, not a housing, we need to build more housing issue. That goes back to the sort of the money stuff, right? It's all about money, greed, and all that kind of stuff. And lastly, we also do talk a lot about deinstitutionalization, and forget also during the 70s in the Reagan era, he decimated HUD. And when he decimated HUD, it cut the funding for public-based housing by 70%, and 90% of that 70% that was cut was for people who are have disabilities and who are also living in poverty. So where are our problems? You got lots of them to fix, probably too many. But I think you're kind of also talking about like where are peer respites. Peer respite could be a form of, in a smaller version of sort of like a hotel space where somebody can stay when needed with extra support. But we only have about 40 of those across the country.
I was thinking more long term, like that people live in these hotels, long term, they have their spot, and they, instead of an apartment that's, going to run costs up, they go to the bathroom down the hall or whatever,
Can I jump
Well,
in
in
real quick?
Michigan, we have a number of motels that do that. They generally have the 10 to 15 spaces that are closest to the office that are rented out on a nightly basis, but all the rest in the back are, in general, people live there full time. It's the more, I don't know what to call them, the less quality places that are doing that. You're not seeing the Marriott's doing that. It's the Nights Inn and places where a lot of people wouldn't even want to spend the night, but people are living there. And that's where that's where a lot of in Michigan, that's where a lot of our homeless are being placed. So it is being used. Maybe not in California, but if you're in California and you're on SSI, which a lot of our folks are, you're getting $914 a month in benefits. I don't know how anybody even lives in California on SSI. There's just no way you can make ends meet on that. I mean, in Michigan, you can just barely do it. And that's only, if you're well connected and you have roommates. And I mean, homelessness is partly, because the benefit structure we give people with disabilities doesn't meet anybody's needs.
Thank you.
Susan, you want to call on somebody?
Scott's been there for a while. Scott, are you still? You want to unmute yourself and?
Okay, I'm listening to this, and one thing I think we have to take into account is you mentioned elected officials, and let's face facts. They are getting their money from the political action committees, which are funded by the drug companies. And so they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. And that's what we're up against. I hate to say it, but that's a reality. So the chances of them passing legislation to address our concerns, I don't think as of right now we're very high. Mostly because, like I said before, they're funded by the drug companies in effect. So that's one thing I noticed. And I worked in politics, so I don't know but I know they're funded by drug companies. And you talked about force. I've seen people pulled out by the police because he was singing the lyrics to the MASH song from the MASH movie. And there's no control. There's no control saying, wait a second, he's allowed to sing a song. What's your problem with that? And I grew up in the 70s, and in my area, if you did not follow your parents' religion, they could put you into psychiatric care, drug you, and you had no choice. And there was very little recourse. So I don't know how we could do this. We got to work on a way to get them to bypass this current situation and say how bad it is, because they're just, like I said, they're being funded by the drug companies in effect. And that's the hill we have to climb to get anything done. That's what I wanted to comment.
Comments from the panel? Otherwise, we've got Sam next on the list. Sam, you still with us? All right. Thinking we lost Sam.
Hello, sir.
Sam,
here.
Oh, okay, Sam.
Okay, ma'am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Sam. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, ma'am. Long time. But I just, remember the last time I was with you, contact with you, was about the same issue, maybe 2000 and January 2001, of which I had in the High Court here, London, judicial review, of which it was so badly presented that I was not allowed to strap my barrister. Of which the barrister said, the solicitor's firm says, yeah, we are sorry, but we'll give you £500 of compensation for what because they didn't present you properly. But yet, madam, as I'm talking today, on the 30th November last year, I just went to collect my iPhone telephone, which had broken screen. £50 I paid. I had a receipt. I had a bank statement. And when I went there, because I don't know why, but there was a lot of conspiracy, mainly from my family, who came and said that they hear something wrong with me. I said, no, you people, I told you to contact me at all because you have already failed me totally long time ago. And now I need to be on my own. I need to be my own. So I told them nicely that I demand to have my telephone. Please call the police. The police came and put me in the hospital live, and I'm talking to you. So that I've been in the hospital ever since November 30th, with no cause for it, just because I went to collect my telephone. But I understand the level that they gave me ever since I was index offense, which was very manslaughter. But I understand that the label I have acquired can never let me be free, and of which I will try to do. But here in this country, it is impossible. It's impossible completely to have somebody represent, because it is a racist society of which this Act of 1983 is completely consistent with human rights, of which the United Nations even directed the country here to make the Mental Health Act consistent with the human rights, of which this country is significant signal to as a member of what they call the veto powers. So, I don't know what I will do, because I have already attempted now to apply in the High Court so that maybe I can present myself, because other. But there's nothing, as you well know, that I have documents by no less than 5 doctors who say no. Some of us don't know anything you can do. Two of them ran away and are working in Toronto, Canada. They can never afford to work in this country. One of them was the only Caribbean I know who was a consultant doctor, Dr. Mackenzie. Another one was an Indian gentleman called Dr. Apu Chakrapat. He said, what can we do? What can we do? We can see we are small, cog in a very big machine of racism. So they can do. But all of this, madam, is nothing other than political activism, of which you must be defined rather than finding yourself, of which I said all the time in America. The first constitution in the whole world that was written by Jefferson a long time ago, but of which it says, God gave us talents and phobias of any character, but of which nobody judges you. You can never judge anyone, because otherwise you are not God creating these talents of which he has. And therefore, some of us in racism, as we see, some of our talents are completely misinterpreted, misused in order to undermine your character. Therefore, character assassination, of which satire and paralyzation is the mentor. I mean, the mental attitude of Western civilization. But when we say with Black people who come from Africa that have been here a long time, but I've been in this country for the last 43 years, for which I should have been naturalized, of which I have the passport, I vote and all these things. But I haven't said, is my character, is my personality, is it not a bad thing that you can see that use of third party, which this. I mean, I most like a gentleman from California University called Dr. C.A.R.E, Dr. Reed, who wrote about confronting political domination and public bullying, of which I understand categorically that I have understood, but the rest of the people, other than the election of Trump, and you can see what's happening with Trump personally, but this is something we can never leave alone, and not until society stands up and fight for the individual sovereignty of individual, as said by the oldest constitution of 1776, Jefferson, of which was put in order to stop the revolution, the French Revolution. But people people have choosing the industrial production of cutting people's heads. They call revolution, the guillotine and all that. But please understand where I face. I don't know whether we'll have to refer to you again, if I'm likely to get a hearing report. We Black people are completely compromised, and it is very, very sad to see that we are biology defines us rather than the intellectual content, as Martin Luther King said and died for. Come on. Because
I have a question for you. Where are you from? Where are you from?
I'm from Uganda originally.
Okay, that's what I thought. I wondered if anybody on the panel has anything they want to react to, and then I see Vesper shaking his head, and then I think for hand raise we go to Terry, and then I've got a whole bunch of comments I'd like to. I don't want to lose the chat either. So Vesper, you got something you want to say?
Well, first I want to emphasize we got Vanessa Ramos, who had her hand raised. So we want to go to Vanessa, then Terry. And then I wanted to say that just as a reaction to what Sam was talking about earlier, because Sam had talked about the Immigrant Act, talked about some of the pieces with the UN and some of the international advocacy and components and what it looks like in the United States and all these different things. And one thing that's happening, Sam, is I can say at least in Massachusetts and in some areas of Massachusetts at some hospitals through the University of Massachusetts, there are mental health acute units that are filled with immigrants coming to this country from Haiti, from Arab speaking nations such as Iraq and otherwise. Like there are so many folks coming in, and they are being integrated from those mental health acute units into these community behavioral health settings, and then there's not enough services to actually talk to the folks. And then there's really the question in the first place: did they ever need the services? All right, in quotes, need. You know what I mean? There's this whole piece, right? You have a lot of these folks coming in who are unhoused for that period of time, and they are deemed as a disturbance to the white suburban neighborhoods in Massachusetts, and they are then brought into these mental health acute units and these spaces, right? And this is a serious issue. You know what I mean? If we don't acknowledge that, then I don't know what we're really doing in the first place, right? Because as we were talking about earlier, we want solidarity with Black and Brown survivors, right? And there's a big piece of that as well. So yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that.
Thank you. Any other reactions or comments related to Sam and Vesper? Okay, so you're right. Vanessa was next, and then I'd like to just look at some of the chats so that we don't lose some of that. So Vanessa, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, and thank you like to all who spoke on my behalf. That's very kind. You know, one of the things that really comes up is I've noticed that certain, which has been said by the panel. So first, let me thank the panel for their amazing job. You know, so thank you. You know, one of the things that I've noticed is that it appears that that a group of family members, not all family members, like Keris mentioned, right? A group of family members have really been brought into the C.A.R.E court fight to really lead it. And in my observation, and I know one of the counties described C.A.R.E court as the literal expansion of AOT, which, you know, we know is problematic. You know, one of the things that, you know, I saw and heard and read in California was that, you know, when C.A.R.E court was first released or unleashed, I should say, it was proposed as an act that was going to meet the needs of the most extremely disabled. So people that were at the highest, that need the highest level of care. But we've watched what little by little, what this has turned into. So I think public opinion has really been confused by the housing crisis that's happened, you know, nationwide, and particularly in California. You know, the preparing for the Olympics that's coming in 2028. You know, my family, when they prepare for a quinceañera, they start preparing 2 years, a year in advance. So if we think that we're not preparing for the Olympics, we're simply wrong, right? And then we have our governor who's behaved in a manner that is very dangerous. The role of a governor is a certain role, and the role of legislatures is another role. But we've seen the state blend the line or erase the line, and because several organizations are dependent on those state funds that come through the counties, we've seen the co-opting of the Oversight and Accountability Commission that that oversees certain mental health funding in California. So I say this because it's little by little, there's been a stronghold on the level of care, the type of care, who gets the care, then the advocacy, right? I remember when Cal Voices had the Access ambassadors who did a great job at going in, and counties were really nervous when Access ambassadors were present at their department meetings. But what did the state do? They took that contract, right? They said, no, we're going to give this contract to another peer run organization to run that. And I'm not saying that that other organizations do a better job or not, but my point is, the advocacy dollars are controlled by the same state that has moved towards complete control. And I hope that we all consider moving away from the affinity for certain political parties, because in California Democrats are not behaving as Democrats. They're just not. They're being bought and sold, and we're seeing it, and to the family members that are on the line, that have spoke negatively about our community, we welcome you. We welcome you, and we welcome you to meet us, to share a meal with us. Like for me, I don't bite, I don't kick, I may cuss, but I'm proud to live, with a psychiatric diagnosis that today I understand was caused by trauma. I'm proud to be 11 years clean off of heroin and meth. And I am, the face of a schizoaffective diagnosis. And I raised my kids and I live a beautiful life. So I don't want to keep on going, but I just wanted, just to share that insight, because the notion, like Keris has taught me, that like we're too well or we're not well enough is just bullshit. It's like, we are the faces of recovery. Let us lead. And if you're not, then we will lead, without asking for permission. And Clare, thank you for all the work that you've done. I know that you've worked really hard and you've had very uncomfortable meetings, and I'm just so sorry that the information has fallen on deaf ears. I welcome all to the abolitionist movement that's forming, and I'm just so thrilled for what's to come, because it's uphill from here, united.
Vanessa, I'm so glad you mentioned the abolitionist movement, and I wondered if Clare wanted to respond, because she mentioned your name, and I know Vesper also was involved in the abolitionist movement.
And Keris is leading. Keris, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut it off, but I gotta say that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're abolition. I've recently discovered I might be an abolitionist. I was just being me and trying to locate, trying to articulate to myself, I think as a lot of us are, what is the, unifying themes here that are bringing together this very intersectional issue. Because I think in terms of, California and coalitions, including the Coalition Against C.A.R.E, who you saw there was extraordinarily intersectional, right? I mean, it was the Corporation for Supportive Housing, it was the NAACP, it was folks doing decarceration work, folks doing, there's been a lot of, in California in particular, a lot of the litigation that has happened has been in the jail and prisons conditions space, and people realizing how messed up our incompetent to stand trial process is. And there's just organically, people who have been realizing how marginalized mental health consumers are and why, finding each other. And so I think, I think my own vocabulary and thinking on this is evolving, and I am benefiting from, thought leadership from people who are looking at mass incarceration and abolition and what that means. And to me, it's really about creating a true incisive critique about how we got here and how we're going to get out of it.
Any other panel comments?
I want to say really quickly that I think people have this idea about abolition where it's you dismantle institutions overnight. No one has any resources. They're all in the streets. It's the world has plummeted into chaos. And that is an inaccurate, completely inaccurate depiction of abolition. So, I mean, I would say read some of the early writings of Frederick Douglass, read some of abolition in the context of enslaved people in the United States and some of the political struggles, because abolitionist groups, as it related to enslaved Black folk in the United States, there was a divide there too. There was an internal struggle around what that looked like and how. And then I want to say now, when we talk about abolition and a lot of these things, we want to build the conditions for a society where we no longer have involuntary commitment or involuntary psychiatric interventions, right? Where we no longer have the most incarcerated people in the world in the United States. I mean, you know, on this panel for Mind Freedom International, I think that that's the reason why it's such a pressing point when we talk about the United States, because from an international perspective, we are detaining and disappearing the most people in the world. So we need to talk about that, right? So abolition is, again, that context. And I wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob, did you have something to say? You looked like you might. No? Okay. All right. So I just want to comment. I haven't read every chat. I'm trying to follow it. That was my job and not doing the best, but as best as I can. So I heard early on people were writing about it's worse in Russia, it's worse in China, it's worse in, and I know we have an international audience here, as some of our folks who have spoken are international. Is there anybody who put some of that stuff in the chat would like to say a little more about that before I move on to the next hand raise? Just wondering.
I do have more to say about that.
Go for it.
I would venture to say that the way in which imperialism looks globally has a different brand, right? And some of them are under the guise of a democracy. Some of them are under the guise of communism. But the truth is that a lot of them are imperialist and authoritarian governments and nations that generally serve in the interests of an elite and powerful few, regardless of how that structure is then displayed and thought of. For example, the weaponization of communism, you see this idea of like maintaining, you know, an equal society, but who's maintaining the equal society? The people in power, which means it's not functioning as communism was intended or socialism was intended, right? Then you have in the United States, capitalist democracy, right? These ideas of a democracy, right? But who has the voting power? Who does that go to, right? What campaigns are backing what politicians? There's a lot of these ethical gray areas and nuances, right? And then you end up finding out, oh wow, I don't actually live in a democracy at all, right? Like, and you're like, oh my God, my world. And that's what's happening, I think, globally, in a lot of ways. So I do want to caution folks that when you say like it's worse here, it's worse there, I think it's different, right? The control mechanism is different. What it looks like is different. I do agree that there are some places where I'm like, it is overtly bad. So like in Singapore in 2020, there was a man who was like executed, who was like labeled with schizophrenia, and he was executed on the premise of like, I think bringing in like, it was a tablespoon of heroin into Singapore. So he was killed. His life was taken, right? In Singapore under an authoritarian government for those reasons. So there's, yeah, it can be overtly bad in that way. But when you think about like the scale of people being disappeared and how, it's scary and ominous in a different way, where it's like, oh wow, like we will disappear and people won't notice. And that's a part of the system and the machine and the industry of the United States.
Thank you. I love your global mind, Vesper, always. Any other panelists comments on that? Or other people in the chat that were in the chat?
Yeah, can I say something about what I see misnomer and hypocrisy of America? America now is something very serious when we talk about liberal democracy, because the people who did first hand forward independence, which was serious matter, which they fought first of all, I mean, brother, the unification of America, say United States. You know how many people died? They tell us that some people died more than in first world war or something like that. I don't know. But madam, to achieve what? To achieve what you could finance as a leader of the free world. But I say now, people like us, we come from East Africa. My example, main example is Nyerere, the late Nyerere of Tanzania. Oh my God, who became a saint after he had died in 1997, because everybody Tanzania look at him and say, no, this man, we never have anybody who can, and therefore they wrote a petition to Pope and said, look, we have never seen a person. Was the Catholic was going to charge almost 3 times a day, I don't know, please make him a saint if you can. They made him a saint, he's a saint now. But in a Western world, which is in this country, there was a gentleman, BBC's footballer, and but he said, the language used and what is in the United States is exactly 1930s German. True the fact, which we can see now ever since the previous took place, which is multiplied so much that we don't want to do. Anybody can be killed, anybody can die, anybody can do anything because this one. Yeah.
Is that you? So we have a whole lot of people with hands up.
No, of course. I did actually.
I want to make sure everybody gets a chance. So I think we have Terry Light, but I always appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Terry, I think you're next.
Okay. Thank you very much for having
I'm
this.
sorry, the other Terry. Pick Terry.
Okay.
Then you're next. Then you're next, Terry Wozniak. Terry Light, then Terry Wozniak, okay?
Hi, everyone. I just want to bring in that I'm somebody who's been homeless. And I did not consider my choice of being homeless has something related to mental illness. I would just definitely never over going to get locked up again. Because the loss of consciousness and control over my mind and my body was not something that was ever going to happen again. And when I was houseless for some 10 years, I did organizing. There are organizers who are houseless on the street doing really good organizing. And many of those are aware of the carceral system. They will talk about it as the foster care system, the school system, our mental health system, child protection system, our prison system, our schools. But even the way people think in their families, they've been taught to be carceral at home, to whip their children. And to me, the whole entire paradigm that needs to be changed is the rights of children, the rights of family members in community. A family by itself is not a community. A family needs to be connection with other families, and the families need to have discussions with school teachers and the schools and the governance of their communities. What we do have in our country is a lot of violation of neighborship. You know, I just remember the second law in the 10 Commandments is to love your neighbor. Look how we're doing that. I'm not Christian, but I look at that and I go, and these seem to be like really good rules. Why don't people follow them? And the other thing is there's also a lot of property rights laws in those 10 Commandments. Property rights. Well, there's property rights about this is mine, I made it, versus I own this land and all these 30 or 100 acres. There's a real big difference in those kind of property rights. And I live in Alaska, and the majority of houseless people are here because of colonization. And I am here in a settler, and I live in a colonized house, and I'm in a house that is run by systems by the white supremacy history of our United States. There is a really steep problems. If we don't look at history, we're going to have a problem understanding this problem. If we don't open up dialogue and have a justice process around this whole thing, our laws are not built on justice. They're built on the small elite. Our court system designed to punish those people who are bothering them and each other. Because like if we have a small family and it's trying to survive and keep their jobs, it will do everything it can to keep enough peace in the hands so the people who have to go to work can rest. Those are the big systemic things. And I say that from growing up in a military family that was very isolated and something that was educated about what power is. A lot of civilian people don't know what to see around what power is. It's unconscious. It's not talked about. And I just want to lay that in the room. You know, people who have force and power over others are not considered crazy. They should be. Who the hell's who calling who crazy is a really big question we have to ask. And you can talk to everybody on the streets and ask that question, and they're going to say, yeah, that's a good question. And maybe that could go into the court system. Who is calling who crazy? What is the context here? And that's it. I just wanted to say that. And also, like, Poor Magazine is in San Francisco. Western Regional Advocacy Project is in San Francisco. These are really good resources to help unpack the whole thing around houselessness.
Thank
And I
you,
just want to put
Karen.
that in. Thank you.
It's so great to see you. And this is such an awesome discussion. I want to make sure, holy cow, we have so many people that want to talk. Terry, I think the other Terry Wasnick. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but Terry.
No, I didn't realize somebody was ahead of me, so my apologies. Yes, I am really thankful you're doing this and the focus on the California stuff, because you see, I wrote this in chat as well, but I'm a Minnesota resident who went out to California to try to help someone I knew from support groups online who was losing her insurance, was homebound and bedbound, trying to connect with resources, had 55 hours before that trip, trying to help her connect with her phone. You would have a cell phone that was working. It was a mess. But the point is, I wound up from the point that I landed in California, I wound up with severe lack of sleep for about 2 weeks, extended my trip to attempt to help my friend get her health insurance, which ultimately happened. And California is so different from Minnesota insurance. It was a huge learning curve. Anyway, I wound up in the California psychiatric system on both a 72-hour hold and then a 14-day hold, despite having had arrangements to have an Airbnb that I could go back to, despite making connections with Project Return respites. That none of that was acknowledged or allowed. So my boyfriend literally had to fly out to California and come get me. And the conditions in the Glendora hospital where I wound up after the UCLA, it was awful. The numbers to call out were taken off the phone. And in one of the units in Glendora, you had to wait your turn and they had to make the phone call for you. And so maybe you could get out 1 or 2 calls in the entire day. And I used to work psychiatric in a community behavioral health hospital here in Minnesota. And none of what I experienced there would have ever happened, in Minnesota, because it was radically different from what my experience was. And I'm a certified peer support specialist here in Minnesota. People that were at the hospital, most of them didn't even know what a peer support specialist was. So it was just, and this just happened in March. So it was a horrible experience. And I just thought that you guys know that from a Minnesota perspective, what I experienced out there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you're still here, Jack Riley. Are you still here? Okay, then I had Jennifer. Jennifer still here? Okay.
Anna just had her hand up the longest right now.
I'm sorry, who?
Anna.
Okay, let's go with Anna then. I think we had a whole bunch of people ahead of them we've lost. So if in trying to give everybody a chance to speak, if you've already spoken, can you hold it till the end? And just be respectful that there's other people and we're losing some of them. So Anna, go for it.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you can hear you.
All right, thank you. So one thing I wanted to talk about was the harm of wellness checks, because I feel like a lot of people think that wellness checks are somehow like a thing that like I've had the police calling me by neighbors, assuming that, you know, that's something that would protect me. But unfortunately, just the problem is the police is not trained or trained well enough to handle these the mental health crises, and oftentimes just, especially in this country, just end up escalating it further. And even in this discussion of police brutality, a lot of times it's not discussed, the police brutality that happens during wellness checks, and especially that the intersection of being a person of color, especially Black, and also disabled or mad, and how that makes it even more likely to experience shootings when confronted with the police. And unfortunately, the discussion on like the part of seeking help is the idea of call a hotline. Like the idea is to call a hotline is very encouraged. However, those hotlines oftentimes will call the police on you. And that's especially bad because it's happened to me when I was talking to Trevor hotlines and I was a child. And this was supposed to be like a safe place for LGBT children. I contacted them, I talked to them a little bit, and I didn't even mention having a plan to end my life, just kind of having had suicidal ideations. And then I hung up, and like 30 minutes later, I had the police at my door talking to me about how they needed to send me to the psych ward because they heard some disturbing things. And the hard part is that this is supposed to be a safe place for LGBT children, but you're basically outing them, like by having the police called on them at their homes with their parents. Like, what if they're not out to their family? It's especially dangerous that way. So it's like the harm of these hotlines and the idea that it's supposed to help, but oftentimes, like I've had a lot of traumatic experiences with those wellness checks. It's especially scary. And I can imagine it's even worse if you are Black or Latino, even worse. So it's like, it's the problem that even though there are supposedly trainings for the police to handle mental health crises, they're just not trained. Oftentimes the idea is just that they see someone who's having a mental health crisis, and in that situation, like it's hard for them to follow directions. Like they are already in a state where maybe they are not in conscious with reality, and so they see that as kind of like, oh, they're not following orders, and then the idea is to escalate. And it's especially bad that way. And just because of that, it's just the fact that the police is what's called to handle these crises. And then either like even if the police doesn't engage in violence, still they will force you in a psych ward against your will, or even send you to jail, is especially scary and traumatic. Like just reading about so many instances, I was reading about several Black women with schizophrenia who were killed during wellness checks, and how common and often it is. And the fact that some people who are suicidal will actually use that as a way to end their lives. They will just lie about having, you know, a violent urge, and then the police will shoot them, but it was just a way to end their lives. And it's especially bad the way the police is not trained to handle mental health, and yet they're the ones who are called. And just kind of like, even with the training, like it's on us to kind of just know, like, and I wish some of us knew what to do when the police is called, because I can imagine for other people it will be much worse. But it's just in that moment, like I had no idea the police would be calling me. I was a child, but for some people, they just don't know how to handle it, especially if they're having a crisis. So it's like something I just wanted to discuss. It's like, it's very sad that just like the idea of wellness checks is still very popular, and a lot of people don't realize the harm of it.
I'm going to jump in here because I really appreciate your comments, because it's near and dear to my heart this last few months. And my neighbor was murdered by police, like 12 feet from my house, and they left him on the road, and because he said he was going to kill himself, and he came out with a gun, not a gun, he came out with a knife, which was not aimed at them. It was on his throat and he said, shoot me, and they shot him. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to be traumatizing to people, but it's this, I'm still dealing with this. But so thank you for talking to that. But I also understand, I have a great deal of empathy for his father who called the police, who didn't know what to do and thought a wellness check was the right thing to do. It was a wellness check. He wasn't doing anything wrong. I wondered if Keris had anything to say about that, because I know you are part of NAMI and you speak for also families and anybody else on the panel, but I'd love to hear your wisdom on that.
I'm not a part of NAMI now. I was a part of NAMI. That is a past thing. And I am a family member, so I do speak for families. I'm a family member. So this idea that we're one-dimensional, don't know where that's coming from, but just to speak on that. But I will say, and I'll, I think that as I started to talk about earlier, about this idea that what we're doing is safe when we're putting people in involuntary mechanisms to get them into treatment, whether it be outpatient or inpatient. The idea of safety is a false illusion, and I think a narrative that we need to counteract to start talking about the people who are killed in the act of getting them into that treatment. Some of them never even make it, right? They're killed before they even get there. And what is very striking to me, and you can actually, and again, not to promote my podcast by any stretch of the imagination, but if you do want to hear Miles Hall's mother talk about what happened to him and the advocacy that she did to get the 988 bill passed in California, one of the things that she did say, so basically he said he was having a tough time. She had been told to let the police know beforehand that she had a son with a mental illness. It's a Black family living in, I believe, Walnut, California, which is a area that is predominantly, like, could it be any whiter? It couldn't. It probably could if they didn't live there, but they live there, so, pretty darn white. But at the end of the day, she was encouraged to let the police know that she has a son, young man, 18, 19, 20, with schizophrenia, diagnosis of schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. So if anybody else called the police would be aware and send proper help. So you can listen to sort of what unfolded, and basically what unfolded was the family calling the police because they had already had this long conversation with them, and the police came and shot this young man at 23 dead. So she fought for the 988 bill, and one of the things she said to me is that, you can hear it on the podcast, is she's very disappointed that the bill does not have police out of one of the responders for mental health emergencies. So I think, there's a lot of work to be done around understanding the role of the police, which should be none in mental health crisis, because they're not peace officers. I don't know, that's a misnomer. We have so many misnomers like AOT, assisted outpatient treatment. No, it's coercive treatment. Let's just call it what it is. Care court, it's so caring. No, it's not. It's, you know what I mean? Like, let's just kind of be real. But, I'm really trying to now collect the names and circumstances and dates of people who have been killed in the name of safety for them, so that we can also address this narrative that involuntary treatment is safe for people. It's killing people.
So I just wanted to say, Bob started by asking about the narrative and what's the narrative. And that's part of the narrative. So my neighbor was Mexican-American, very quiet, calm person, lived here for a bunch of years. And I'm like, why would you shoot him? And after they shot him a few times and he went to his knees, they shot him some more. And to me, it's incomprehensible. And then I offered to help, and now I'm afraid. I hate to see some paranoid. Please, nobody ever call a wellness check on me in Bernalillo County, because I'm pretty sure I'm not getting out. I live on a cul-de-sac. It'd be hard to get out of here. I don't think I'll get out good. So, but I think this is like, I think we probably should do a Judi's Room just on this topic, to tell you the truth. And I have there has not been an article for 4 months since it happened after the first 2 days. And I want to know, and this is a question for Bob Whitaker, why can we not get the media involved? Like, why are they not writing about this? This is horrific. And again, probably another Judy's room. And I don't mean to make it about me, but I am, because it's big, it's huge. And somebody said wellness checks, and all you guys, I love you. Don't ever call a wellness check on me. Not at least while I'm in Bernalillo County, New Mexico. But I don't think it's just here. I think it's around the world. And Keris, if you want to do a narrative around that, I'm already writing about this. Talk to me.
I want to throw something in. I've had a wellness check called on my family because my son was having a violent outburst.